name is Joyce. I'm going to be a future scientist and your future customer.
Now, if any of you have checked out the demographics recently, Joyce is going to be a future employee and a future customer. When we're talking about this issue of diversity and inclusion, it's not just something that's the right thing to do. It's good for business. We're talking about how to do business better. People say, why do we need diversity in tech? There are hundreds of companies today that are the most valuable organizations in the world. And they are literally companies that do not have that much diversity. Why do we need diversity now? Well, I'll tell you, from a historical perspective, diversity is required for sustainability. So anybody can start a company. It doesn't take much to do it. And anybody can grow the company. Certainly, that is something that's going to happen. But in order to stay in business over the long term, organizations have to have diversity. It's not just the right thing to do, it's good for business. And there are countless examples in the past that show that diversity is something that's good for business. Take, for instance, the oil and the steel and the gas industries. Remember, years ago, that was a huge industry here in America. And there were literally thousands of companies that specialize in those areas. Today, only the strong have survived. The same thing with tech. In the next 10, 15, 20 years, only the strong will survive. Those who see diversity as an asset and are very conscious and intentional about acquiring the best talent and the most customers that they can possibly acquire. So when we talk about the problem of diversity and inclusion, is it really a problem or is it an opportunity? So we're going to look at these two words today, problem and opportunity, and we're going to reflect on those. So as we look at this conversation, do we really need to go 5 steps behind in order to move 1 step forward? There have been quite a few organizations over the last 2 years that have said we're going to make a very conscious effort to do more work in this area of diversity and inclusion. But very little progress has been made. And that's because everybody jumped into it and said, oh yeah, we're going to go ahead and hire more black people. We're going to hire more women. But that's not the solution. Because the problem is not just hiring more black people or hiring more women. The problem is in inclusion. So I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. There are several things for us to keep in mind. One is that we have a myth of meritocracy. The reality is that meritocracy is really subjective. Because when we think about meritocracy, what can be merit for one may not necessarily be merit for another. Just like in the example that Kiko used, whereas for a male to walk into a CEO's office and to assert that there are some things that need to change around here, it would be viewed as gutsy. And it would be viewed as something that is valued in the organization. But for a female to do it, it would be viewed negatively. So when we talk about this issue of meritocracy, there are a lot of subjective things that go along with it. There's also an illusion of inclusion. A lot of organizations, they use my son's favorite daily snack as an example of diversity, chocolate milk. So they get some milk, they pour some chocolate syrup in it. The chocolate syrup just goes to the bottom and sits there, and voila, we've got diversity. But that isn't really how chocolate milk is supposed to go. You're supposed to stir it up. You're supposed to shake it up. You're supposed to make it into something that is delicious and desirable. And in the same way, we have to do that for our places of business, for our organizations. We may have to stir things up. We may have to shake it up. We have to do some things that will help our organizations to be better. And then there is implicit bias, which I'm sure we'll talk more about in a little bit. So we have to shift our focus. My kids didn't draw this, I did. So in the past, Dee and I'm a walker, but they're filming, so today I'm going to be patient here. In the past, we've looked at diversity and inclusion as something that is imposed on the organization. Diversity and inclusion was seen as an outlier, and it was forced on the organization because it was the right thing to do. But we want to talk about diversity and inclusion from the perspective of being organic, interwoven throughout the entire organization so that it is something that everyone feels a part of. When we talk about diversity as a term, it is a very controversial word to use because the minute that we say diversity, folks tune out. They shut down. They turn the conversation off because this is not something that we want to talk about. We're tired of talking about diversity. We don't want to talk about diversity because there's no value in it. I once did a presentation at Duke Realty, and one of the things that they had a challenge with was employees used to view diversity as something that was being forced upon them. But when the Eskenazi Hospital was being built, they got that contract. And one of the reasons why they got the contract was because of their diversity efforts. And they didn't even realize that they had robust diversity efforts at all. Here you have people in marketing and sales, and they were unaware of the diversity efforts going on at the corporation, but yet that's the reason why they won a contract. So they called me in, and everyone, all the white guys around the room were listening and hanging on to every word I had to say because they realized that we can make a lot of money by leveraging this diversity stuff. And in the same way, you have to be able to present diversity and inclusion from the perspective of how we can help the organization make money, how we can help the organization save money, how we can help the organization to achieve its goals. And this is something that's valuable for everyone, not just for that person or you, but it's valuable for all of us because we are creating opportunity together. So the inclusion solution is to actually consider the fact that maybe we don't have a diversity problem. Maybe the real problem is inclusion. Yes, the real problem. That real problem is not diversity, it's inclusion. Because if you have an inclusive environment, anyone could walk in and feel a part of the organization and thrive. We say, oh, well, there's not enough engineers, black engineers, there's not enough female engineers. They're unicorns, they're imaginary. But the reality is that these individuals aren't imaginary because what about your sales? What about your marketing, your communications? What about other departments in the organization? We want to go beyond just thinking about diversity from the perspective of females or blacks or Latinos to actually thinking about it from the perspective of perhaps there are older individuals that are not employed here. Maybe we don't have that many individuals with disabilities. Perhaps we have a large population of people that speak different languages or that have different religions, but they don't necessarily feel as if they are included. They're represented, but not included. Maybe there are some white guys who feel we're here, we're represented, but we're not included. So when we're talking about this notion of diversity, we don't want to just limit the conversation to the typical male, to African Americans, to women, to Latinos. We want to think about the fact that there may be individuals who are a part of the LGBT community or who are veterans that may not necessarily be included. So if we have an inclusive environment and an inclusive culture, then diversity is not a problem, because diversity will flow naturally from where inclusion exists. So we need to also ask those hard questions. Is this truly an inclusive environment? And you don't have to go far. You can ask the people who work right in your organization, because they will know whether or not your organization is inclusive. They will be able to tell you, we don't think this is inclusive. We think that there's more of a frat boy mentality. I can tell you in our office, we have people next door who were throwing darts. They're throwing darts at the wall. You know, this is a tech building, so they're doing all sorts of crazy stuff over there. We hear bells ringing, ding! We hear the darts going against the wall. They're having, I guess, parties over there. I don't know what they're doing. But it is an environment that can be exclusive for individuals who may feel like they look like everyone else, but we don't feel like we're a part of this environment. So we want to ask those hard questions. If we're not inclusive, what do we need to do to become more inclusive? How do we need to become an employer of choice for everyone? And then we need to include white men. No problem is going to be solved if we exclude the majority of people who are in management and in leadership. White men must be included. And the reality is that white men are diverse too. If we had a room full of white men, guess what? We still have diversity. You want to know why? Because there are people who are German American, who are Italian American, who are Jewish American, who are all sorts of different ethnicities and backgrounds. They come from different economic statuses. They have different religious beliefs. They have different educational backgrounds and skills. They have different marital statuses. They are diverse. Just like if we were to have a room full of African Americans, or a room full of Latinos, or a room full of women, there is an abundance of diversity. So when we're talking about this topic, we're talking about everyone. You. Everybody is included. And then we have to understand and educate employees. So we need to understand not only our customers, but our employees, right? So we have a lot of big data, and that big data points us in a lot of different directions. So we need to use some of that data on the employee side too, in order to really find the best and brightest employees. Because you may have a little Joyce that comes in the door, and because she doesn't look like everyone else, she's discounted. Now, Joyce is a star in her school, but in some workplaces, she may not necessarily be a star, right? Because they say, well, she doesn't look the way that other people look in this place. So we want to make sure that we understand the historical contributions of other groups. For instance, did you know that the windshield wiper was created by a female? Did you know that women have been involved in tech for years? In fact, they have been among some of the first data processors, not just data processors, but first engineers and first scientists, and inventors. So this is not new for women. The same thing with African Americans. There are a whole host of African Americans, and every time we stop at a stoplight, we ought to be reminded an African American man created that stoplight. When we pick up the telephone, we ought to think Alexander Graham Bell wasn't the only person. He had the assistance of an African American to help him get the patent for that telephone. And that same African American man also helped Thomas Edison with the light bulb. So when we're talking about this issue, we have to begin to look at the contributions of others and what those contributions mean for our organization, what it could mean. Chrysler has had diversity and inclusion efforts for years. And their diversity and inclusion efforts have been instrumental, especially when every other automotive company was going on the slide down. But one of the things that was a saving grace for Chrysler was their Chrysler 300 automobile, which was redesigned by an African American male, and that automobile wound up winning more new car awards in history. It also resulted in an economic boom as well as innovation in terms of having a new automobile come about, the Chrysler 200. And this has transformed the Chrysler 300, which used to be just a regular car, into a luxury automobile. Now, if it weren't for their diversity and inclusion efforts in the first place, he wouldn't have been able to get into the company because his aunt wrote a letter to Lee Iacocca when he was president years and years and years ago and said, what can my nephew do to get into Chrysler and to work there? Because he is super talented. And Lee Iacocca said, here's what your nephew needs to do. He needs to go to this school, he needs to get these skills, he needs to do this and do that, and then apply to Chrysler. The nephew did all those different things, and he wound up not only applying to Chrysler, but he got the job. That wouldn't have happened at a company that had a facial policy for diversity, where they just said, we value diversity and equal opportunity too. But he not only got in the company, but he was able to work his way up so that he received this prestigious assignment to make an impact on Chrysler's bottom line. So when we think about diversity, we need to think about the contributions of Asian Americans, of Indian Americans, of Latino Americans, of all different groups, and how it can help our organization. And when we're onboarding people, individuals need to understand that this onboarding process is not because we hired an individual who was a woman or who was gay. We hired this individual because they are the best qualified person to do the job. They come with impeccable credentials and they're going to make an impact on our company to help create more opportunity for everyone. So we have to distinguish between different and negative. So one group does not have to be the villain in order for everyone to win. We don't want to demonize or villainize or make villains out of any particular group. We don't have to look at it as someone's going to lose here. Why can't we all win? That's what we're supposed to do. This company, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, creates opportunity that people around the world covet. So we can create situations, especially at these big tech companies where diversity and inclusion is, where innovation is great, we can create opportunities where everyone can win. And then we have to make sure that different does not mean unequal or less than. There are a lot of differences between EO and affirmative action as well as diversity, but the big difference is that diversity is proactive and it's focused on opportunity. So you want to think about how you can help the organization to make money, to save money, to achieve organizational goals using diversity and inclusion. Because at the end of the day, the key drivers are not the fact that we're trying to do what's right, the key driver is globalization. It's changing demographics and it's competition. How can you beat out your competitors and be number one so that 10, 20, 30 years down the line, you have sustainability? There are a lot of different ways that we can be inclusive. We can be inclusive in terms of the organizational dimensions, job or position, seniority, work location. For instance, there's a difference when people say I work at headquarters compared to I work at a field office. That's diversity. But there's also ways that we can be inclusive in terms of parental status, appearance, educational background, recreational habits, religion, income, and more. And then the primary dimensions, which are the things that we see, but really may not necessarily mean that we have a lot in common with. As a black woman, I can't assume that I'm going to have a lot in common with another black woman. I may have more in common with a white male. So we want to begin to take off our traditional thoughts and concepts about diversity and think about inclusion differently. This nature of diversity is systemic, meaning that schools, workplace, and the community all overlap and have to think about solutions together. And that's why each and every one of you are here. We have come here today to think about solutions and to think about how we can do things differently that will impact each and every one of you here, as well as impact your organizations, the communities that you operate in, your employees, your customers, your students, and everyone else that you interact with. This is the time for us to come together and to develop solutions with excitement, because we have a great opportunity ahead of us. Let's be inclusive and not think about diversity as a problem.